Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to A Date with Darkness podcast. So excited to be here chatting with you guys today. Super stoked. I have a special guest for today's episode planned for you guys. And today's guest is Dr. Joy Harden Bradford. Dr. Joy is the creator and founder of Therapy for Black Girls. And I think this will be Dr. Joy's third time on the show. So she's a longtime friend of ours. And I thought I would invite Dr. Joy on. And today's going to be a little bit of a different show. She's written a book, Sisterhood Heals, and we invited her on definitely to talk about the book and just sort of catch up, see how she's doing, and give us some tips on how we could form sisterhood alliances, how we can show up for sisters, and how we can lovingly detach when the relationships are no longer working in our favor or no longer serving us. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Joy.
So I am trained as a psychologist. I am in the state of Georgia, and I am the founder of Therapy for Black Girls. And Therapy for Black Girls really is an extension of the love I have for outreach work. So my background before Therapy for Black Girls was my full-time job is in college student mental health, and outreach presentations were always my favorite thing. And so I really feel like I just get to do outreach all the time with Therapy for Black Girls. So the mission of the organization is really to make mental health more relevant and accessible for Black women and girls. And we do that through our podcast that comes out every week. We do that through community conversations. We have a membership community that people can be a member of. And as you mentioned, I have also released my first book called Sisterhood Heals, which I feel like is, again, an extension of that work and the conversations that we have as a part of Therapy for Black Girls.
I love that. Thank you so much for explaining that. And you know, when you talk about or when you think about the motivation behind for Sisterhood Heals, what do you find that like women are seeking or needing in sisterhood?
Ooh, that's a good question, Dr. Jones. So I really feel like at the core of it is being seen and being heard, right? I think that there is a thing that happens with Black women where we can be passing each other like on a sidewalk or randomly in a grocery store, and we can exchange like a knowing glance, or just kind of really affirm that we see one another. And I think that there are so many spaces that require us to be invisible, or where we are invisible to other people. And in relationship with one another, I think we don't have to be invisible. And so I think that that's the role that sisterhood plays very powerfully for us, is an ability to really see one another.
I love that. And do you feel like in terms of when you think about sisterhood or when you're talking about it, do you feel like that is specifically for Black women?
The way I'm referring to it is, and my practice is predominantly, well, exclusively Black women. Much of my work has been centered on Black women, and so I really don't have any experience or knowledge of what sisterhood and relationships look like outside of Black women.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. Because I feel like, I have, mixed viewers that watch it. And so it's good to kind of give them, just some background. But the other thing that I wonder about, in terms of sisterhood, and then we'll get into the book, but just from your experience over the years and working with women who want to connect with each other and want to bond with each other, do you feel like the evolution of sisterhood has changed?
I mean, I would say yes and no. I don't feel like it has changed in that people have been craving it, I think, kind of historically, right? Like, I think
Mm-hmm.
connections with other women have been important and integral throughout history. What I do think has changed is the way that sisterhood looks, and that now it is far more digital. So 10 years ago, you wouldn't necessarily be connecting with women all across the world, right? Like, that's even how you and I connected, was in a podcasting course
Absolutely.
digitally, virtually.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, I do think sisterhood looks very different, but I don't think the core of it, in that people crave it and really want to be a part of sisterhood, has changed.
Good. Yeah. And I think you bring up some excellent points in that people feel like they want to change, but now we can do it globally, internationally. But the other part that I also wonder about too is because we're moving in such a technological way that people or a digital way that people feel like connections are a little bit more different or disconnected, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I do think the digital connection sometimes will give people this false sense of closeness that I do think we have to be careful with, right? Because I think, depending on what you share on social media platforms and like what kinds of things are out in the world about you, I do think it gives people the impression that they sometimes know you more closely than they actually do. So I do think that that's something to pay attention to, that you don't just have a bunch of false close relationships, but that you are
Mhm.
also intentional about people really knowing you, and really allowing other people to, really knowing other people as well. Because I think sometimes you get fooled in thinking like, oh, I have a bunch of close friends, but do they actually consider you close friends as well?
I love that. I love that. And so now to get into the nitty gritty, as you know, my work has been in abuse victims and just abuse dynamics, whereas yours has been in the connection space. So a lot of people are going to be listening to this show and trying to figure out, especially women, and trying to figure out how they can connect more with women, especially if they don't have good relationships with their mothers, if they don't have good relationships with their sisters, or just grandmothers, or they may not know their family. Can you give us some advice on how women who are struggling or connection has always been a challenge, where they can seek out sisters, where they can, what are some steps they can take in learning to bond if that's a foreign concept to them?
Yeah, so I think really we have to start this conversation with people giving themselves grace and not seeing themselves like at a deficit if
Mhm,
connection has been difficult in the past, right? Because if it
mhm,
has been, it's likely largely been through no fault of your own, right? So, you probably had very little to do with the ways that mothers and grandmothers and, aunties and all of that like interacted with you. And that is a large part of the foundation for how we connect with other people later in life. So that's where I want to start, is by saying you are not broken. There's nothing inherently wrong with you if connection has been difficult for you in the past. But one of the things that I think is so cool about sisterhood and friendships is that they do have the possibility of being a corrective emotional experience for us, meaning that even if we have had difficult relationships with caregivers and siblings in the past, you could have an incredible relationship with another woman that totally rewrites your idea about what connection looks like. And so I think staying open to these kinds of experiences is really important, and going into each new experience understanding that, hey, this could be another opportunity for a great connection. I think that group therapy can be a great way to work through interpersonal kinds of issues that have come up for you in the past. Even if you don't necessarily like get close to people from the group, because sometimes that's frowned upon, but it does give you, I think, a different window into how people perceive you, how you are coming across, and you can do the same for them. And I think the lessons and the skills that you can learn as a part of group therapy will serve you well in connecting with other people outside of the group.
Absolutely. And so I like that piece in terms of group therapy because that's oftentimes very forgotten about or people can seem a bit reticent to like, I don't know if I want to talk in front of a group, right? If they have social anxiety or they have like some challenges, like, like I don't want to put my public business, I don't want to put my business out there in public for all these people to kind of do that. So if someone has trust issues or like social anxiety, like what are some things that they can do to kind of manage that on their own to kind of take those first steps?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that happens with anxiety a lot of times is that we think people are paying attention to us far more than they are. So we are worried about going to social situations because we think, oh, people will be judging me or, people will laugh at me or something like that. But what could be helpful is for you to go into a social situation and pay attention to how many people are even giving anybody eye contact.
Mhm.
Often what happens in social situations is that people are on their phones or, they're talking to whoever came with them. And so the idea is that people are really not as interested in us as we often think. And so being able to observe that for yourself, I think can be really helpful. I also think working through some kind of anxiety hierarchy can be helpful. So putting a list down of the things that you are most afraid will happen in a social situation to the things that you are least afraid about. And typically you do this with a therapist, but I think it could be helpful even, kind of solo, like getting yourself more comfortable with the lowest thing on the list and then gradually working your way up. So, let's say you are most anxious about like going to your class reunion this summer. Well, that may be the top of the list, but at the bottom of the list could
Mm.
be having a private conversation with a classmate on Facebook, right? So could you start at the bottom and work your way up through that hierarchy to really get more comfortable with the feelings that come up for you related to whatever this anxiety situation is? I think that something like that could be really helpful.
I
I
like
also
that.
think in terms of trust though, I think the only way to really practice with trust is to like do it, right? So some of these things you can't just like journal your way out of. Like
Mhm.
it has to be practiced in relationship with other people. And so I think that means sharing small things with other people. So not your deepest, darkest secret, but
Mhm.
can you trust somebody with a little bit of information and then see what they do with it and then continue to share as it feels appropriate?
I love that. I love that. And I think part of even doing that is just sort of really recognizing that if you want to try something new and get a different result than what you've had in the past, which has maybe been a world of hurt or, just something that just didn't sit well with you, I think you have to recognize that relationships take risks. Yeah, and so I love that. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about, maybe your motivation or your muse. When you think about sisterhood for you, who has been your sister that's been pivotal, or the sisters in your life that have been pivotal?
Ooh, I feel like it has been lots of different people throughout my life, which is why, I'm really glad that I've stayed open to like meeting new people because you never know like when you're going to meet somebody who could become important to you.
Mhm.
So I am still close to two of my college girlfriends, like they both live in Atlanta with me. Well, not with me, but we all live in Atlanta. Um, and so we are still cool. Like we're currently in the throes of like planning our annual Super Bowl party. So I love that they know me, like they've known me for so long. And so they are probably the space where I feel the least amount of like needing to ever be on because they've known me since I was like 18. So, like I'm not Dr. Joy to them, like I'm just Joy. And so I love that I have that kind of history with them. I also have, friends who I have met through entrepreneurial spaces that have been really helpful for me. Just because there are all these things that come up around like running a business that like I just never imagined. And so it's really helpful to have other people to talk to about, HR stuff or taxes or, whatever all of these things are. And so I think it's been really important for me to kind of continue to be open to making new sister friends as my career has continued and as I have continued to grow.
That brings up an excellent point and something that I've been thinking about lately. As you are a public figure, a very successful public figure. And I work with a lot of women who are very successful, like yourself. Do you feel like as your success continues to grow, that there are things that you want to keep in mind when you're connecting with people, maybe as like being more protective or more selective, because people will naturally gravitate, part of people naturally gravitating towards you, maybe success.
Hmm. That's a good question. I feel like, Dr. Jones, I have always been kind of guarded, probably like you, because of our training, right? And so to me, it isn't as much about like, oh, people are trying to get close to me because like I'm successful. It
Mhm.
is more trying to be careful of like people trying to kind of get free therapy, or, they find out you're a psychologist and then like they unload all of this stuff.
Ooh,
And so I
mhm.
feel like I naturally, well, maybe not naturally, but definitely because of training, tend to be a little bit more laid back and then like want to observe people across time before somebody ever is very close to me. So I can say I haven't had any experiences where I feel like, oh, this person just wanted to get next to me because of this, because I feel like I'm already vetting and like,
Yeah.
really assessing situations before it even gets to that point.
Can you talk a little bit maybe about that sort of vetting process that maybe might have evolved over time?
Yeah, so I think, I tend to kind of want to see people multiple times, probably in a public setting, like running into people at events, or maybe we have been on a panel together or something like that
Mhm.
before we would even like grab lunch together, right? So I really want to know kind of like who you are in rooms of other people. Maybe we connect on social media and I want to kind of get a feel for like what kinds of things you share, and do we have a similar sense of humor and like those kinds of things. So I think I am just somebody who like wants to gather quite a bit of information before I say, okay, this is somebody, that I like want to spend like some dedicated time with. And again, I think some of that is like naturally me, but I think some of that is because of my training as a therapist as well.
I love that. I love that. So I think part of what people can take away that are watching you or, or hearing you say is you're looking for authenticity. You're looking for consistency. If this person is who they portray themselves to be, kind of like what they've got going on, almost kind of like you're just sort of looking, you're hanging back and watching and observing just to see, take it deeper than face value and have them show up consistently before they even get anywhere close, like lunch or something like that, is what I'm hearing you say.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's a skill that, again, like you said, with our training, it kind of comes with us. But for the lay person, especially if they're very like lonely or they're wanting to connect, they may just sort of jump in both feet first.
Yeah. But I really think a good gauge for that too is paying attention to like how you feel after an interaction, right? Because I think you will sometimes have interactions with people and you leave feeling like, oh, that was really nice. Like I would love to hang out with them more. And then sometimes you leave interactions like feeling either really tired or really anxious, and like something just feels, off maybe. And I think that that's good information to pay attention to, because that is typically not us getting too far in our head, right? Before we have any time to like overthink and like rationalize what we're feeling, our body tends to be very honest with us, right? And so if you leave an interaction feeling anxious or like, I just don't know about that, something feels off, then it's probably good to pay attention to that, because that could be an indication that this person may not be a good connection for you.
I love that. I love that. The feeling, the gut is always
Mm-hmm.
going to steer you in the right direction, and pay attention to what your gut is sort of telling you. I love that. How if how can I be a good sister to you? Like how can people be good sisters to other women?
So one of the things I think is really helpful in this case, and I think it's good, like if you have the indication that you are thinking about, like, oh, how do I show up for this person? That is always a good sign. And I think one of the ways that we can do this most impactfully is to try to premeditate people's needs, right? So if you can kind of, if somebody's struggling and they're like depressed or whatever, and they're having trouble like feeding themselves or, doing laundry or whatever, if you can go over and say, hey, I made you dinner, or here's your favorite, here's a dish from your favorite takeout place, or if you can go over and like wash a load of laundry if y'all are close enough, I think those kinds of things can be really helpful and would not necessarily be things people would ask for. But I think your level of closeness really can dictate that you can kind of sometimes intuit what people need. And I think that that's a great way to show up for people in sisterhood. I also think it's important to like put things on your calendar that are important to the people in your life, right? So if you have a big presentation coming up, or if there is a death anniversary or your birthday, or like what kinds of things feel important about you remembering in this person's life, and putting that on your calendar so that you make sure to like check in or send flowers or do whatever. I think that those kinds of gestures can go a long way.
I love that. And one of the things that I hear that come up often for people is they may only have one or two people that they're very close to, one or two sisters, right? What are the expectations? What expectations should you have if your circle of sisters is very small versus someone who may have a bigger circle?
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, right? Like I think you have to think about like how much time and energy and resources you have to dedicate to a huge
Absolutely.
circle anyway. So a lot of times people have like these big circles, but is everybody actually very close, or is it just a bunch of people around, right? So I think if you have one or two close girlfriends, that is a blessing. Like that is
That
huge, and
is.
I don't think you should take it for granted or feel like, oh, other people have bigger circles or whatever. Because while it may be great to have more people, if these two people are really kind of thick as thieves with you and, have kind of shown themselves and, y'all have a very tight relationship, there's absolutely nothing wrong with those one or two people.
I love that. And I love that you said that because I don't think there's anything wrong with a smaller circle either. Sorry, that's my sister. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a smaller circle either. But one of the things that I've come across sometimes with people is when they do have a smaller circle, it's almost kind of like they put all of their eggs in one basket and their expectations are very high for that one person meeting all of their needs. And so, I'm wondering if you have any advice for that to maybe people that maybe need to adjust their expectations better, as opposed to saying, well, if they didn't meet this need or that need, then they're a bad friend or they don't love me as much as I thought they did.
That's such a great question. And I appreciate you highlighting that because I do think that that comes up for people, right? And I think we have to be careful. And, sometimes people do this even in romantic relationships, right? Like want your partner to kind of be the end all and be all. And I think Esther Perel writes about this beautifully in a lot of her work around how our villages have never been set up for like one person to meet all of our needs, right? So your romantic partner meets some needs, your best friends meet a different set of needs, your coworkers might meet a different set of needs, the people that are parents with you at your kid's school, like that may be a different set. And so I don't think that there's anything wrong with kind of spacing out where you get what needs met. So I think it can be difficult to, be somebody's best friend and feel like they are counting on you for all of their needs to be met. And if you are in that situation, then I think it's important to have a conversation before you become resentful so that you can let the person know, like, hey, I'd love to be here for you in these kinds of ways, but I can't do X, Y, and Z. And then to really see if you can maybe help that person to find other people who can meet other needs, because it can be sometimes really easy to like just fall into the pattern of one person being there for everything, but there are likely other people in your life who could meet some of those other needs. Now they don't all have to have the title of like best friend, right? But they could definitely be very significant important people in your life.
Absolutely. Like there's levels to friendship.
Yes.
And along that same line, what if there's history there? Um, Meaning like, I've known you for years and years and years, right? But sometimes in sisterhood or friendships, we ebb and flow in the relationship. Maybe we started out being as thick as thieves, but something happened and we became distant. How do we remedy that or, at least emotionally cope with that or adjust to that?
Yeah, so I think people don't always expect this, and that's why I think it hits people by surprise, right? Like, I think,
Mhm.
again, you think about in romantic relationships that there will be ebbs and flows, but the same thing happens in our friendships, especially if they have lasted a long time. And it doesn't necessarily mean that like anything bad is happening. Like sometimes there is just distance. I think the key here, though, is to make sure you say something about it when you notice it happening, right? And maybe there's something that can be done about it, but maybe there isn't. And so, it's okay for like, even like you mentioned, like there are different levels to friendship. And so somebody who started out as like a level one friend, kind of like the person you call for everything, at some point they may become a level 3 or 4 person to you where you just kind of check in a couple of times a year or whatever. But there also may be some grief with that change, right? Especially if you didn't necessarily want them to change. But sometimes circumstances dictate that they have to be a different level of friend, right? And so I think allowing yourself the space and time to grieve the close connection that you had and allowing time for it to look different and not blaming yourself or the other person, right? Because again, sometimes things just change. There isn't, and most often there isn't like a thing that happens, right? Like there isn't always a betrayal or some big activating
Right.
experience that happens. Sometimes, stuff just happens. Life just happens.
It does happen. And I'm wondering if you can give us any tips or suggestions on how to have a difficult but loving conversation to point out disconnect or disappointments with our sisters. What sort of tone can we have? How can we initiate that? How can we approach that? What sort of things should we say when we have to have that kind of conversation?
I think that this is a really important skill to be able to practice and cultivate because, again, in any relationship in our lives that is important to us that continues for long enough, there will be some of these things that come up where you have to have a tough, maybe awkward kind of conversation.
Mhm.
And so I think it is important to think about like the timing of these conversations. So after, you don't want to necessarily try to have this after y'all have had a big falling out or when people are like exhausted from a marathon week at work. Now there may not be any perfect time, but there are definitely some times that are going to be better than others. And so I
Mhm.
think you want to focus on your experience without leading with judgment, right? So you
Mhm.
don't want to say like, oh, you've forgotten about me, I don't think you're a good friend. Like that is probably
Mm.
not going to be actually an invitation to a conversation. But I think you could say something like, hey, I really miss you. It feels like we have not had our, Tuesday night tacos in more than 2 months. Like, I wonder when can we get together? So really being able to lead with whatever you're feeling as
Mhm.
opposed to judging the other person or making interpretations about why you feel like they're behaving whatever way they're behaving is typically going to go better than an accusation.
I love that. I love the fact that you're just sort of leading with your own emotions and how you're feeling without being an accuser, a blamer, or even leading with anger or disappointment and just sort of
Right.
making the space. So I think, like you said, that's a really important skill to be able to sort of check your own self and say what you're feeling in a way that's nurturing, but also get your point across. I love that. Thank you for putting that
Agreed.
out there. Yeah, I love that, and that is definitely an important skill to have and to cultivate, and I think also too, one of the things that I'm wondering about is if you have a relationship with a woman and you're maybe wanting to deepen it, you're vibing, you like this person, but you're not sure what you can do to take it to the next level Can you share any tips or suggestions about that?
So I think you being able to be vulnerable typically opens the space for more vulnerability, right? So this again doesn't mean that you share like your deepest, darkest secret as a way to deepen this relationship, but maybe there's something that has happened between the two of you or some shared experience that you could share more of your feelings about. That is typically what actually deepens relationships. So not necessarily like gossip or, all of those things, but being able to kind of have shared experiences and then being able to lead with feelings and emotions, I think, are what actually deepen relationships. So even telling them, like, hey, I really enjoyed our time together. I really look forward to seeing you on our weekly walks or whatever. Like, that can be a way to kind of indicate that you would want to spend more time with them or that you're looking to deepen the friendship. But I also think if there's been any conflict or anything, being able to address that in a way that is kind of putting things on the table can also be a great way to deepen friendship.
Yeah.
But also, I think that there are like lots of like card decks and things like we're not really strangers and like the table topics and those kinds of things. Like I think those kinds of open-ended questions can also allow you to know somebody a little bit more. So I think being able to play some of those games is a great way to kind of deepen a friendship as well.
I love that. Yes, and I've absolutely played a few of those with my friends as well, and it's been a good time. A
Mhm.
good glass of wine or something like that. It's been a good time. It's been a bucket of laughs and just stories and things like that because those games can go on for hours.
Mhm.
I love those. Well, another question I have, and this is something that also comes up a lot with friends in terms of disappointments or just something has happened that maybe you're not okay with. Are there times when you shouldn't speak about things versus when you should? Like there's sometimes I've noticed that there are people that just want to disconnect or disengage or detach, right? Because you talk a lot about attachment in your book. Is there times when are there times that it's better to just do that versus having a conversation, or what would you advise there?
I honestly can't think of any time when you wouldn't want to say something. Right now, you might not want to say something in that moment, but I definitely think any tension you're feeling or feeling some kind of way, as we say it,
Mhm.
I think that those are really important conversations to have if the relationship is important to you, right? And I think so many of us have gotten into this habit of like, oh, we just cut each other off at the first sign of trouble, or it's like, oh, friendship shouldn't be this much work, and so I don't want to
Yeah.
do this kind of thing. But honestly, the intimacy really comes with our ability to have some of these difficult conversations. And I think we have to
Mhm.
remember we're not actually robots, right? Like I know we often talk about like being super women and all of these things. That's a lot of a really complicated conversation, of course, but we're not actually any of those things. Like we're human beings with like emotions and feelings, and that means sometimes we will get stuff wrong, right? Like we will make mistakes, and even in our
Mhm.
best efforts we will sometimes disappoint and hurt people. And so being able to say, I'm sorry, or being able to say, ouch, that hurt is really important for the livelihood, I think, and the health of our friendships and our sisterhoods. And so even when it feels uncomfortable, I think you have to say those things that cause the tension and the friction, because being able to get through those things could actually make your relationship closer. I think a lot of times we're afraid if I say this thing, she won't want to be my friend anymore, or she's going to think I'm a nag. But honestly, if you can have those conversations successfully, that often makes the friendship closer.
I like that. I like that. But I also feel a little bit differently.
Okay.
And maybe this is me and my own bias. You might be the more mature one here. I don't know. You might slap me on the hand. Because you and I, we've had conversations. But I feel like you and I'll just use myself as an example, is like I feel like I may have had a friend before in the past that has done something that has been overtly disrespectful. And I'll be 45 in September. So if we're in our 40s, or even in our 30s when this has sort of happened, I feel like, okay, if something's overtly disrespectful and anybody can interpret it that way, what are we doing here?
Yeah, so I don't know that a conversation always means that you want the relationship to continue, right? Like, especially in that kind of a situation, right?
Yeah.
Like, if somebody's been overtly disrespectful, I think you can
Right.
say, like, hey, that was not cool. And I don't think we should be in each other's lives anymore, right? Like, but I still think
Ah.
it's okay to say it, you know? So even if you are not interested in the conversation, like saving the relationship, I still think it's good for you to be able to give voice to something that you experienced.
Okay, and can you talk a little bit about why that is?
Well, I think it's just important for our own authenticity because I think a lot of times if we
Mhm.
don't, we then end up wrestling with ourselves about like, oh, I should have said this and can't believe I let this person disrespect me and like that kind of thing. And so I think when I think about that, I think better out than in, right?
Got
So instead of you
it.
internalizing it and like criticizing yourself, it's better to then go ahead and let the person know like, hey, this is not cool with me.
I love it. So that you're saying that, it's almost like an emotional purging, it's being authentic, it's adulting in a way that sort of, I this is what was, what I saw, what I experienced, and that's not cool, and we could end it, but you're saying just to purge everything with that experience and then detach.
Exactly, because what the other option to me would be that, like, this person doesn't know, so you may have observed it as, like, clearly disrespectful and even other people, but if the person doesn't, and then they just, like, realize you're not returning their phone calls and, like, you're not responding to messages, then you now have to deal with this, like, okay, telling this person, like, what happened. So either way, I think you're going to have to say something, and so to me, it is just better sooner than later.
I love that, but you can tell I've done some things, but hey. But I love that, I love
Um,
that. What are some things as you evolve in different stages of life, like, going from motherhood to now being the Dr. Joy to whatever other fabulous things that you do in your life? What are some things that you want to see as you evolve from your sister circle?
Ooh, I really like spaces where I can just be myself and like talk about all the random stuff I watch on TV and the random books that I'm reading. My kids are very involved in sports, and so I like spaces where I can kind of learn more about like the sports that they're playing and like connect with other moms in that way. I think as I have continued to grow, it has been really important for me to have spaces where like I don't have to be my professional self all the time, right? Like if I'm on and like at a speaking engagement or something where I know that that is who I am, that's one thing. But if I'm like at the ballpark on the weekend, like I don't want to be Dr. Joy, like I just want to be Jackson and Julian's mom, right? So I think that those kinds of things, in spaces that have really nurtured that for me have been important to me as I've continued to grow.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and being authentic with your own sisterhood journey too. But I'm curious in you writing the book, what sort of surprises that you had in, like, did you have any sort of surprises that came in the form of sisterhood after the book?
Ooh. Well, probably I don't know if it was a surprise, but I worked with a writer, Tracy Lewis Giggets, in writing the book. And I really enjoyed that process because it felt like a microcosm of sisterhood. So we would meet on a weekly basis and talk about what we would call the Black Girl News of the Week. And some of that made it into the book and some of it didn't, but it really was helpful to kind of always be thinking about the examples of sisterhood we were seeing in real life. And I really feel like she helped me so much throughout that process because she's worked on tons and tons of other books. And this was, of course, my first one. And so it really helped me to kind of be ushered through the process with her help, because she could kind of let me know where the landmines were and like, okay, here's how you talk about this. And, it was just incredibly helpful. So I wouldn't say it was as much of a surprise as it was a delight to have that be an experience that came out of writing the book.
I love that. I love that. And as you're talking about some of the Black girl news, were there any examples of Black girl sisterhood that really stood out to you in terms of modeling or embodying what you thought for this book? Like, do you like, because there are people that are probably watching this show that, that don't know necessarily what that looks like, or they may have an idea, or they may have heard about it, but they're not sure if there's any sort of models in their life that embody sisterhood modeling, if that makes sense. So are there
Mm-hmm.
any that like stand out to you, either from TV or something popular, that embodies certain themes in sisterhood that are really healthy for Black women?
So two things that I talk about quite a bit in the book were both
Mhm.
Insecure and the show Girlfriends,
Good.
because
Love
I feel
those
like
shows.
those were some of my very early introductions and some of I think a few of the examples of people getting it right. Right, I felt like the characters on Girlfriends and Insecure like were very real depictions of Black women, and I just loved both of those shows. But I think if I think about like real people, one example that I wrote about was when Nicole Hannah Jones was denied tenure at UNC Chapel Hill, and there was another sister, I forget her name, who was up for like I think a department job in the chemistry department, who then rescinded her application after everything happened with Nicole Hannah Jones as an act of solidarity. And so sisterhood is of course about like the people who are closest to us in our sister circle, but I also think that there's a sense of global sisterhood, right? Like the kinds of things that we do and the connections we have with women who we don't even know, but just because we are all Black women, there is this shared understanding of, like wanting to stand up for you and kind of, I see you. So I thought that that was a very powerful example as well.
Those are very powerful. And the one woman who recently committed suicide. There was
Oh,
a lot
Dr.
of,
Bailey.
there you go. And I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't remember her name, but there was a lot of solidarity
Yes.
around what a lot of people perceive to be an injustice at her university as well. So there
Right.
is some of that. But I'm also curious, because that leads me to another point in terms of workplace solidarity for Black women, especially in spaces or places where there may be two or three of us, but there's not a lot of diversity. Are there some suggestions that you can make to women who may be entering a new place, and there's already women there, in terms of how they can show solidarity to people that are entering a foreign space?
Yeah, so I think chapter 6 of the book is called Systems or Sisters Over Systems, was one of my favorite chapters, because I think we find ourselves in these kinds of settings a lot of times, right? And the system, the environment is set up for us to kind of be pinned against one another, right? So this idea that there can only be one Black girl that's successful, or only one of us can kind of rise to the top. And so what that does is then it breeds this idea that I see you naturally as my competition, as opposed to somebody I can collaborate with. But we know historically and otherwise that we go much further together. And so, as much as possible, I would encourage people to resist this idea that only one of us can be successful, and to look at each other as partners in this space, and to think about like how can we all rise together. So if somebody gets promoted, then your natural inclination should be, how can I keep this door open for other people to come behind me, not to close it in their face. I think that that is how you really combat some of those systems, again, that have naturally been set up for us not to be successful.
I love that. And I think, and I'm wondering if you can even go a little bit further than the systems in terms of, Black women in general. How can we eliminate competitions amongst ourselves, whether it's light skin versus dark skin, whether it's natural hair versus straight hair? There's always something that can have a competitive edge or be, under the guise of beauty. I'm wondering if you could even explain further how we can, make that more of a global effort, or just, natural process where we can eliminate competition amongst ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember and to look at like where did any of that narrative come from? Like that wasn't a narrative that we created, right? Like I think left to our own devices, it would be the case where we just notice differences, right? Like I notice what your skin color looks like versus mine, but it is the history of slavery and patriarchy and sexism and all of those things that have clouded our lens so that light skin is seen as more superior, right? Like the closer you are to white, the better you are, and you have more privilege. And so I think it's important for us to remember that that history did not start with us, and so us continuing to buy into that kind of system is only continuing to hurt our community. And so being able to recognize those things for what they are, but again trying to pull ourselves out of those narratives that really have not been helpful to us.
I love that. I love that. And I think you're so spot on about that, about where that narrative comes from. One of the things that I'd like to explore in our little bit of time left are women who may not have access to sisterhood in their near vicinity. What are some ways or suggestions and where women can sort of reach out and find sisters? Like maybe they live in the south somewhere, or maybe they live in a rural area somewhere. What are some of the steps that people can take to maybe connect when they're regionally isolated from other people?
Yeah, I think, we already talked about technology and, there's a lot of downsides, but I think one of the great things about technology is that it does allow you to connect with people across the world. And so I think there are no shortage of like Facebook groups and communities on these different apps where you can tap into people who are interested in the kinds of things that you are. So I'd really encourage you to get active in some of those groups, or if you don't see one, to create one for yourself, right? Because the idea is that there's nothing that you are interested in that there's not at least one other person that's interested in it. And so if you don't see the thing that you want to be a part of, that may be an indication that you need to create it. So create a group for yourself on Facebook or one of these other apps, and then invite other people to join. If you just search random hashtags in a place like Instagram, you can find Black girls who are into gardening or whatever you are into. There's likely a community of people. So I think being able to use some of these platforms to our advantage to be able to connect with other people is a really good idea.
I love that, and I appreciate you giving that suggestions, because that is a good one to search for hashtags, to search for your groups, to do meetups, and I think even maybe just picking up and traveling and going
Yeah.
somewhere else, right? There's like, just go experience another Black culture, go experience a place where there's like different types of Black people. Chicago is a great place. They have huge Bosnian, Ethiopian, all kinds of folks there that you can experience, and beyond that. So I think those are good suggestions. And so now, as we begin to close out, can you tell people where they can find you, if there's any sort of fabulous things that you're working on that we can support you with?
Yeah, so you can find everything related to the book at sisterhoodheals.com. You can order your copy there, but you can also get it from your local bookstores or check it out at the library or request it at the library if they don't have copies. That always helps. And you can find everything related to therapy for Black girls. We have our therapist directory there, the podcast, all of that is at therapyforblackgirls.com.
And I will definitely be sure to put that in the links. So, is there any other fabulous things that you're working on? Perhaps a sequel to Sisterhood Heals?
No sequel is in the works.
Yay. All right. All
I
right.
feel like I'm still recovering from the writing the first one, so no sequel to announce at this point.
Well, that's a good recovery, I hope, a good recovery. Yeah, making your
Yes.
tour and all that kind of stuff. So I absolutely adore you, always have, always will, and I'm so glad to see. I think we started almost 7 years ago podcasting.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So it's so good to see the growth, and please know that you always have my support. As you know, I text you all the time. And so I love to see the growth, and so I'm so very happy and proud of you, and thank you so much for coming to the show and telling us all about Sisterhood Heals, and I will definitely put all the links so people can find you and continue to support you.
Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Of course.